Hello and welcome to this second EARMA Digital Session. For those of you joining only today, my name is Borana. I am project manager at EARMA, and today I will be your web host. The topic of the session today is ethics support in times of COVID-19. Many of us are perhaps a bit tired of the ever-presence of the topic in the last months, but at the same time, it's important to change perspectives and to learn from it and to see from another point of view. So before we start, I would like to make a few technical points about Zoom. Probably you're familiar with it, but at the bottom of the screen, you can see that you can interact with the panelists and attendees by using the chat or the Q&A session. When you want to introduce yourselves or interact, share information with the other attendees, please use the chat. And when you want to ask questions to the speakers, you can use the Q&A. The moderator of the session today, Stephanie, and myself will then be able to hand the questions over to the speakers for you. I would like now to hand over to Stephanie, who is Research Ethics and Integrity Coordinator Advisor at Ghent University in Belgium, and she is also EARMA co-chair. The virtual floor is yours, Stephanie.
Thank you, Borana. Good afternoon, everybody. We're very happy that you decided to attend this webinar, and it's the second one for the EARMA group. So it's still quite exciting, actually, to do this. I will not talk much. My role here is to introduce to you the two speakers that we have here today, and we will have two presentations of about 15 minutes, and after that you will get the opportunity to ask all your questions. So we will have the presentations first, and then at the end, for the remaining time, we can ask questions. So today the first speaker is Núria Benítez, and she is affiliated with the Catalan Institute for Nanoscience and Nanotechnology, where she is in charge of institutional strategy and development. And our second speaker is Ruth Storme, who is coordinator of the ethics committee and affiliated to the University Hospital Leuven in Belgium. We will take the presentation of Nuria first, and after that, Ruth. So I give the floor to Nuria.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Stephanie, for your presentation, and thank you also to EARMA and EARMA for inviting me to give this talk. I will share my my screen. Okay, so the topic in this presentation was ethics support and lessons learned from the COVID-19. And I wanted to start with what European Union considers ethics, because I found that it's very important to take this into account, that ethics is considered as an integral part of research, and that ethical compliance is seen as pivotal for research excellence. I found that this first sentence is very important, because we need to go far from the view that ethics is like a part of the bureaucracy requested by funding agencies, but mostly part of the research excellence, and also that when projects become interdisciplinary, their ethics issues become more complex, because future applications are more far from the research expertise of their research in development the project. So it's quite more challenging in that sense. So thinking about how I was invited to give this talk, I was thinking that when we think about ethics in research, we mostly have in mind research down on human beings, like social sciences, like medical sciences, or mostly research done on people or in animals. But this is my institute. This is the Catalan Institute of Nanoscience and Nanotechnology. This is a small institute of research situated in the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And our storytelling is most on the size of things that we are observing. We are mostly engineers, physics, and chemical researchers. So we are quite far from this point of view, more on the medical research. On the other hand, we have very diverse research topics among our expertise, and also health is one of them, but it's not the only one. So this is mostly our business. We are working, for example, in 2D materials for different applications, but also on simulations and this kind of research. And finally, in this moment of this COVID crisis, the most challenging project we are developing at the moment is COMBAT. COMBAT was one of the 18 projects funded by the European Commission on the urgent COVID-19 call. And it aims to develop a diagnostic device that can get COVID diagnosis in less than half an hour. We received, as you can imagine, a lot of pressures to put all our efforts there, and we are working very hard, but some ethical issues are also over this project, so it was very challenging to be there. What means research? Normally, research means looking back, looking to the past, or looking deeper, mostly in our case. But ethics, I try to understand that ethics mostly means to look into the future, to be sure that what we are trying to do will not break anything that matters in the future, that what we are trying to do or what we are creating will not be worse than current situations. But looking into the futures is a little bit like this, you know. This is a lot of different pieces, a lot of different dimensions of these pieces, and also on the way we look to them. A lot of different disciplines working together with very different backgrounds and different points of view. And what we need is to being able from the very beginning to have all these different points of view in the advice of these future ethical issues when we start our research project. So what are we doing? We are considering all potential uses of our research outcomes, not only what we expected to do. We are trying to find the way to consider confidentiality, but also public health interest. That is very, very important at this moment. And we need to be sure that this public health interest is not is not making us made some errors on protecting confidentiality or other ethical issues. We need also to consider the controversial between IPR protection and general interest that can be very important also at this moment. The legitimacy of further retention of the data that are being collected now through these COVID projects because of this public emergency, but how they will be kept in the future, if we have the right to keep them or not, or who will be using this data. And also consider that a post-COVID life will arrive. We are nearly arriving at some point now, and research will still be very important in that future. So our researchers still need guidance because too much questions are there. Okay, this picture is I'm sure is very similar of how you're developing your work nowadays. This is mostly how we are working, all of us, giving support to our researchers. And this is also our case, and this is also how we are dealing with ethical issues, trying to keep all confidentiality as much as possible, and building guidance anyway. And maybe it's not as easy as it was when we are seated one in front of the other to build trust and build guidance, but this is how we're working. So we are always debating ethical issues in an online system. We have been meeting a lot of people dealing with this COVID-19 data portal to be sure that we are sharing anything that can be useful to solve this COVID emergency, but also that all rights are being kept. And we are also reconverting our institute to give the best response to this emergency as much as possible, but looking also to this post-COVID situation where we will need our researchers to have continued their own research, doing their fundamental research, given results on other topics, because other emergencies may arise, and we will need to be updated in our science to give the answer that we were able to give now. So finally, what we learned? We learned that we were lucky to have built an ethics support team before we have needed. We created our ethics committee about 3 years ago. This is not an ethics committee giving certificates on ethical approvals or this kind of very formal ethics committees, but it helps us to give advice to our researchers to get the more updated advice on this kind of ethical issues. And we were lucky to have it before the emergency arises. That there is no need to have human or animal interactions in our research in the immediate development of our research to find ethical issues in its performance, because future applications of our research, even if it's fundamental, can have ethical issues, and it's better to think about it on the very beginning of the projects. That all fundamental research can be essential in a future, so we cannot stop taking care of them, because we will need it in the future, and that we need also to build this post-COVID scenario. So if ethics is looking to the future is this post-emergency scenario, and ethics will still be pivotal to achieve excellence in this sense. So we need to keep it in our work day by day. And I think that's all from my side. I will give the words back to Stephanie.
Okay, thank you, Nuria, for your interesting talk. I already wrote down a few questions, so if anybody else has questions for Nuria, you can already post them in our Q&A part. So I see that some of you have already done that, so you don't have to wait all the way to the end. You can already post. And in the meanwhile, we are going to listen to the presentation of Ruth. Ruth, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Nuria, for your interesting presentation. I will share my screen. Okay, hello, I'm Ruth Storme from the Ethics Committee of UZ Leuven, the University Hospitals in Leuven in Belgium. And I'm going to explain a little more about how we experience this COVID period. It's been a very intense period, but also a very interesting one from which we learned a lot. I would like to start by giving some more information about the organization and activities of our ethics committee. So the law in Belgium requires every hospital to have an ethics committee. And the role of this EC is twofold. So on one hand, it has an advisory role with regard to ethical questions in the context of clinical and patient care. But on the other hand, it has to give advice for clinical research. And in UZ Leuven, this role is divided between two recognized ECs. And that's a very unique situation because it's the only hospital in Belgium that works like this. And I work at the Ethics Committee Research. So I'm just going to talk about research and experiments on the human person. Then I would like to start by giving some background about the scope of the Belgian law and experiments, some small information, because the Belgian law is different from the legislation in our surrounding countries and the US, for instance. In Belgium, a medical experiment is defined as any clinical trial or study experiment with humans aiming to improve development of knowledge concerning the practice of healthcare professionals. So medical doctors or nurses, pharmacists. You see the bigger circle, and these are all, includes all experiments. So when you do a research with medical devices, or where you compare surgical techniques, or where you just give a questionnaire to patients, these are all experiments in the law, defined in the law. And a special form of experiments are the clinical trials. And these are the trials with an investigational medicinal product. So that's the smaller circle on the picture. There is a new European law, the clinical trial regulation, that's not yet into effect, but this law only covers the clinical trials, so the smaller circle. So eventually the two circles will be split from each other. But for now, we only have this Belgian law of 7 May 2004, and that's based on and inspired by the European directive. But this directive only covers the clinical trials. So our Belgian law is much broader. As soon as you prospectively collect data with the aim I just mentioned, you're doing an experiment that falls under this law. And when a study falls under this law, several requirements have to be met. For example, an informed consent is necessary for patients, and a study may not start without an ethical approval. Our main focus is medical research, but I have tried to not limit it in this presentation, but it's important to give you some information about this law because it will come back later in this presentation. Here's to give you an idea, an overview of how many projects our ethics committee evaluates every year. So it's around 1,300 initial studies. And sometimes changes or modifications are needed during a study. And yeah, these changes may affect the design of the study or the informed consent or the way of recruitment. And these changes must also be reviewed by an ethics committee. We see more and more changes being submitted lately. You see an increase in 2018. And this is partly due to the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that came into effect. But we also see very complex changes and modifications to the protocol. And also in this COVID period, a lot of amendments and modifications have been submitted, which we'll come back to later on. That was just some background I gave. We will now focus more on the impact of COVID-19 on our ethics committee. You see here some statistics. We had 82 new COVID-related initial studies submitted to EC up to now since the 2nd of March. And we already approved 9 retrospective studies. So these are studies where you all have all your data already available. So you don't prospectively collect data. 30 prospectively observational studies we have approved. So these include registries and surveys. Then 7 studies on residual human body material and 11 interventional studies. That can be studies with an IMP, an investigational medicinal product, but an interventional study can also be where you just take another or an additional blood sample. That's also an interventional study. We have evaluated more than 400 COVID-related modifications. And of the 16th of March, our meetings continued at the same frequency, so 3 meetings per month via Skype for Business or via Zoom. Normally, we have face-to-face meetings with our EC members, but we continue them now in this period on the same frequency online. This isn't something all ECs in Belgium could do, but we have tried to ensure as much as continuity as possible in this very strange period. We will come back now to the modifications because this was a very important fact in the COVID period. So on the one hand, new studies were started in which specifically COVID patients were or are included, but there are also many ongoing studies that were modified in order to be able to continue during this period. And the sponsor must always do a benefit risk of continuing with the trials. So considering the potential benefit to study subjects currently on study treatment, for example, the sponsor can conclude that patients may safely continue to receive their treatment while treatment interruption should be avoided. There are different types of changes, as you can see here, and guidance is really needed for the sponsors on these different types and how to submit them to the ethics committee. You see here 4 major groups of modifications, and it's up to the sponsor. So the sponsor is responsible for identifying under which category the modification falls. The first one, it's an urgent safety measure. An urgent safety measure are emergency provisions and are meant to safely maintain subjects on study treatment, for example, while site capabilities are compromised by this COVID-19 related restriction. You see the different, some definition. So urgent safety measures taken in the context of coronavirus may be taken without prior notification to the agency for medicines and healthcare products and the ethics committee, but the sponsor must inform as soon as possible the agency and the ethics committee of the measures taken and the plan for further action, and a substantial amendment must be submitted afterwards. A substantial modification is a modification with an impact on the subject safety or the scientific value of the trial, for example. And a substantial amendment must always be approved before it can be implemented. So approved by the ethics committee, and if it's with medicinal products, then you also need an approval of the agency. Then we have non-critical or critical protocol deviations. So a deviation is defined as any change from the study design as defined in the protocol. A protocol deviation can be considered as an urgent safety measure if this change has to be directly implemented for the patient's safety, and if it's considered as a substantial amendment. So it's not always very easy to know under which category you fall. And there is a difference in reporting. So just notifying the EC of your modification of deviation and waiting for an approval before being allowed to implement the changes. We see here some examples. In the beginning of the COVID period, we saw a lot of recruitments and studies have been put on hold. And a temporary hold should be submitted to the agency, so when it's with medical products, and to the ECs of the participating sites within 50 days of the decision. And a temporary hold is not a substantial amendment. A notification is sufficient, so you don't have to wait an approval. In the beginning of the COVID period, we set out a rule that non-urgent visits or studies contacts should be avoided or postponed, but an alternative may be to contact the participants by phone or telemedicine visits. So that's to protect study patients from being unnecessarily exposed to COVID-19 at sites which has been affected. So we saw those modifications also very frequently. In cases where continued supply of trial medication needs to be maintained at home, trial medication can or may be shipped directly under responsibility of the principal investigator from the trial site to the trial participants via by a courier. In Belgium, it cannot be by the commercial sponsor, but by a courier. And of course, only possible provided that the product is suitable for transport or storage at home. Home nursing is also something we saw as a change in the protocol. And now we see a lot of restarts of a study that's been put on hold, so the whole study. When you submit a restart, you have to wait for an approval of the ethics committee because it's seen as a substantial amendment. When only the recruitment has been put on hold, a notification is enough. So then you don't have to wait until an approval has been given. We check a number of elements now when we get a modification of restart to make researchers more aware and more responsible about the impact of the current problems. So when we get a request for restart, we reply with the questions below. So we ask the researcher if it's possible to respect the federal and institutional rules like social distancing or protective measures, if that's possible or not. If additional protective material is needed, how many additional persons are involved in the interaction with the participants. We ask to limit the amount of additional persons involved in a study. In which room or building will the study take place? We ask that to check if there's enough ventilation, for example. If the study takes place in another institution, then we ask the institution to approve the restart in writing. And then we ask if there is a need for modifying the ICF or protocol. And if so, then we ask a changed person with track changes so we can evaluate that. So in generally speaking, EC research has mainly an evaluating role. We try to support researchers as much as possible by offering them tools, templates of informed consents or protocols to make it easier for them. But in the end, EC has an evaluating role, and during this COVID period, this was switched to also a visible supporting role for the researchers. Our range of tasks was seriously expanded during this period. We helped researchers with writing informed consents ourselves or academic interventional clinical studies with medicines, and we create an SOP for obtaining informed consent in the COVID units. We have set out a flexible way of submitting the studies, and we were very fast in registration and administration of those studies and evaluation also. There was an arrangement with the federal agency, so for studies with medicinal products, that the agency commits to validate and review in 4 working days. And so the evaluating EC will do that. We had an up-to-date website where you can also find our all the approved studies. Then we contribute to set out national guidelines. And that's also a very important one. We should guarantee that the same rules are applied in the evaluation of studies, even when the pressure is very high. And I repeated it by the challenges. EC should apply the same high quality framework in these exceptional circumstances, but so should researchers. It's very important that researchers ask different questions about their protocol that they submit. What is the scientific question? Is it scientifically sound protocol? Is there a statistical plan? Because we have seen a lot of also international protocols, and ask ourselves whether good conclusions can be reached from these, because there were protocols with small sample size, no detailed statistics, no control groups. And this period with a huge time pressure could not be a free pass. So we had an additional supporting role, but we did not give up our evaluating role. And it was our job to point this out to the researchers. There was a lot of time pressure for the researchers also, but also for the staff and the administrative members of the EC. The staff should also be protected from unreasonable pressure. Yeah, we say we are in a pandemic situation and not in a panic situation. So we use that quote quite often. And then the law of 7 May 2004, where I've talked about it in the beginning. It was also a real struggle because in our surrounding countries, registries, for example, prospectively collecting data, do not fall under a law where EC approval is needed, nor an ICF, but in Belgium it is. So it was very difficult to explain to the sponsor, but also to our own researchers, that the situation in Belgium is different and more complex. So international studies or registries were a real challenge. Yeah, and then the last one, we gave priority to COVID-related studies, but definitely now we're on a point where new studies will be started up, so we must ensure continuity of non-COVID studies as well. Okay, thank you. You can ask questions, or if you have questions later on, you can always email them to me also.
Yes, thank you, Ruth, for that interesting talk as well. Okay, so we have now about 20 minutes left for questions. And I saw already in the Q&A that some very interesting questions have been asked. So we will immediately start with the first question, which came from Fiona. And it goes, have guidelines been given to researchers on how to adapt their research projects to a remote environment? For example, interviews using Zoom or equivalent tools. And I think it doesn't say for whom in particular it is, but I think that both of you maybe have something to say on that.
I'm not really sure if there are specifically guidelines written for that. I don't know. We think it's important to give the participants a good explanation on these remote visits, because also with regard to privacy, it's a real issue, because you don't always know who will listening or will it be recorded and everything. So I think that's a very important one. But I'm not sure if there are guidelines really written out. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. There was a related question indeed concerning that particular point by Aura, who says that at the University of Helsinki, the Ethics Review Board in Humanities and Social and Behavioral Sciences discussed actually about safety questions related to these different remote communication tools. Because, well, how do you know if it is, and now my question has disappeared. How do you know if it's safe to interview people on sensitive issues, for example, via Zoom? Which tools are most equipped to do that, or are the best communication tools, the safest ones? How secure is it to conduct and record these interviews remotely? Any thoughts on that? Maybe Nuria, do you have any experience with that?
No, we don't have any experience. We are not interviewing people, because we are testing, our project will be testing more animals and devices, so no people. But as Ruth said, our institute gave some guidelines, but on general performance of research and general use of buildings and rooms, but not particularly for that question.
Yeah, no, well, if I can speak from my experience, there were indeed general recommendations by the ICT services at our university, which aimed at employees of the university in general, not researchers in specific. They were pretty specific on tools that we could use. For example, at the start there were difficulties to actually use Zoom, because that gave security issues or safety issues. So we were not allowed. Later that was adjusted. But specifically for researchers, I'm also not aware of any specific guidance to that. No, Jonas, I see that you entered the conversation as well. So maybe you have also something from your perspective to add.
Yes, thank you. Well, just a specific thing about there are different. We don't have guidelines either, but we'll discuss this issue and discuss this with different colleagues from different universities. And I mean, Zoom has been particularly problematic, as I understand it. And one thing is, I mean, there are details in here which are important to consider. For instance, it might be acceptable to do the interview via Zoom, although perhaps a phone call might be preferable. Because it's safer, but on the other hand, it's more difficult to ensure that you're talking to the right person. So there are a lot of different aspects to that, but definitely do not use the recording function in Zoom in order to document an interview if you have sensitive personal data, for instance. That's absolutely out of the question. So I mean, it's so complex. There's some things you can do with certain tools, but some things you definitely cannot do, and it depends on what kind of data you have. And so I think it's difficult to come up with general guidelines at this point, because it's also unfortunately a bit underexplored. We don't really know exactly what's and also regarding GDPR compliance, that's not we can't issue guidelines unless we know ourselves. So I think that's part of the explanation. This is really difficult.
Yeah, if there are participants listening well, in their institutions there are guidelines or tools that actually discuss these issues, feel free to share that in the chat so that everybody can maybe check out if there is something useful in there. So do share in the chat section. Okay, great. So then we have a question for Nuria. What have been the specific challenge with regards to research ethics during the COVID-19 pandemic? Was it mainly data protection and privacy, or have there been other issues?
Okay, well, relating to the COVID projects, yes, more challenging issues were on data sharing, because as I said, we will be testing animals considered as reservoirs for the virus, and we should be mapping the existence of the virus in the coming months, up to 2 years. And even if this call makes mandatory to share all data collected during the research openly to the community, we needed to consider whether it is convenient or not to share the situation of those viruses, because in an emergency situation it seems not to be a very good idea. And also other research data that should be shared gives us some ethical issues. But also during this pandemic, we needed to evaluate, as Ruth said, other projects and not necessary projects, but because, as I said, we do not advise projects, but our research development itself. And we were discussing, for example, how to proceed when a military organization is giving us the opportunity to fund any of our projects, like NAITO or other organizations. So we have some ethical discussions even during the lockdown due to the pandemic.
Maybe to add on that, you work with animals a lot. No?
No, not necessary, but in this COVID project, we have a collaborator that we are coordinating the project, and this other partner will be following these animals. Mm-hmm. So it's not our researchers who are collecting this data directly, but we are responsible for sharing this.
Yeah. Okay. Because we had some issues in our institution as well about research with animal research actually, in which cases sometimes animals needed to be euthanized because of interruption of the study, for example. Yeah. Maybe you also, your institution also has experience on that. Was that common? Did that give any issues?
With the animals?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Another ethics committee at our institution. So yeah, we have different ethics committees. So I know we have a lot of experiments on animals, on mouses related to COVID to test new medicines, but it's not in, we only handle the research on human.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, but for example, as far as I know, our institute is seated in the autonomous university, for example, and in Spain, they on the first step of the lockdown, where everything was closed mostly, universities were mostly closed, but not for research groups working on COVID projects, obviously, but also for researchers working with animals that needed to be followed, because obviously there is a code of conduct for research with animals that we need to take into account. We need to take care of those animals, and in Spain, all the lockdown didn't affect this kind of projects. But obviously, I imagine that a lot of them were stopped, because even if you have the right to follow up the care of these animals, other aspects of the project maybe couldn't continue. So, and obviously there is an ethic issue there, because you put those animals on a critical situation and you don't follow up with the project. So there are a lot of things to think about there.
Yes, that was indeed the case when the project was somehow influenced, that this unfortunately also influenced stocks, for example, for animals during the research. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So that was, originally the question came from Jeanette. Thank you, Jeanette. I hope that kind of answers it. Then we have a question from Seya. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The question is related to the fact that research groups were rapidly redirecting their research to produce information and solutions to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Are the researchers aware of the ethical issues? So she would like to know, to try and understand what could be done better from an ethical point of view. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Well, I think the question relates to, and it kind of was, or it kind of relates to a question that I also had, that researchers very, very quickly redirected their research to produce information and solution to tackle this COVID-19 pandemic, whilst they probably haven't thought all the ethical issues out. Normally that is done in the beginning of the research or the design of the research, which now very quickly shifted. So in your feeling, do you think that researchers are fully aware of the ethical issues of this redirecting part, or do you feel that there is a lot of knowledge missing, or things that they haven't thought of, whatever?
Yeah, with the studies that we saw, so I mentioned the international studies, we saw that the researchers just go with the flow of the international researchers, and in their law, their countries, not much of these kind of studies falls under a law where an ethical approval is needed. So that was very difficult. They weren't always aware that needs to go to our ethical committee, because in other countries that wasn't necessary. So that was difficult for us, and also the protocols that we saw that they were written faster than normally. So they were more they were shorter. They just wanted to start. So there was a lot of time pressure, and we saw that, or it was our task to be careful that qualitatively results could come out from these protocols. So that, yeah, it was a challenge, and the researchers I think are aware, but because of the time pressure, they just go and they want an ethical approval, and they want to start.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that in this situation, the research community felt that the light was put on us, and a lot of researchers tried to change their focus to this pandemic, and obviously not all of them are used to do their research on this type of topic, and didn't know the protocols. But also the other thing is what you're saying for animals. We need to consider also what we are stopping to do this, because we are not more people than we were before the pandemic starts, and we are not working twice. So we have the same quantity of minds working on research that we have before the pandemic, and we are and we need to think about stop doing something to do this, whether we are the one that have the expertise on this topic or not. And we found it also here. The Spanish Ministry for Health opened a call, on a basis of first arrived, first served, not with a deadline, to fund COVID research projects, and they received hundreds of. And I'm sure that a lot of them, as Ruth said, maybe has not a control group or very fundamental parts of the project that are needed, and that anybody working on this for a while know that are necessary. But people needed to help, and we were not aware that researchers with different expertise needs to continue their expertise, because maybe it will be needed in a future phase of this pandemic, or in another emergency situation. But yes, it's my feeling.
No, I got that impression from a member of the ethics committee in humanities and in our university as well, that he sensed kind of that many researchers kind of jump on the bandwagon and hope to drive into the success or the importance or the popularity of research topics, but it's not always clear how to address the relevant ethical issues as an ethics board, but it is very important to do so. I can imagine that it's very difficult for an ethics board to actually see through what is just popularity or what is just, as Ruth says, it has to go quick. So it's just of being quick and how to respond to that. So I think that's definitely a challenge. If I'm checking time, I see that we have we have one question left. There is actually also an interference of Joanne. Thank you, Joanne, for your tip. There is apparently a journal that gives some interesting talks on the use of Zoom in this kind of situation. So it is in the Q&A section. For those of you who are interested, there is a link to the journal article. So that's definitely a big added value. The last question, what about research projects in the non-biomedical field? So social sciences, technology focused research projects, are they reviewed by research ethics committees in your country? And the question was for Ruth.
Yes, of course. We have a lot of studies in these areas as well. We have an ethics committee for more social and societal science, so also natural, life science, engineering. But we, or that ethics committee cannot evaluate the studies that falls under the law I've mentioned before. So studies that falls under that law can only be reviewed or evaluated by a recognized EC. So that's our ethics committee research, but there are a lot of experiments with social science with children in schools and everything, and that's reviewed by another ethics committee that's linked to the university, and they also saw a lot of studies and modifications to the ongoing studies due to the COVID-19.
Yeah, I think it is definitely so that the entire remodification because of COVID-19 is definitely not something from medical or life sciences only. So it's humanities is very much affected by this as well, obviously. Okay. Okay, so that were about all the questions, and I think our time is up. Maybe Ruth or Nuria, do you have any final comments that you want to share before we switch back to Borana?
No, just as Ruth said, if anyone has any question, you have my email in the presentation, so I'll be fine to receive it and to answer it.
Yes, and all the presentations will be, as Borana already posted, I think, on the EARMA website, so that will definitely not be a problem. Okay. Yes, I will give the floor back to Borana.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. This was a very inspiring and very interesting session. I'm sure that we could have continued for at least half an hour more, but time is up for now. So I would like to thank all of you, Stephanie for moderating, Nuria and Ruth for speaking today, Jonas for intervening, and all attendees. We were around 60 together online today. Before I end, I would like to invite you all to the next area meeting, which will take place on the 20th of October. We were planning to do it in Leuven, in Belgium, initially, but due to the current constraints, we're planning to do it digital. So you will receive an invitation during summertime containing more details about the meeting, and I would also like to encourage you to be active on Synapse so that we can also develop together the content of the meeting. This in general, but I think also in these particular times, keeping the community together, it's very, very important. So for now, I'll say goodbye and hope to see you soon, physically at some point, and digitally for sure very soon. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.